Hello and welcome to my book presentation. This is my first book. The title is Between Two Homelands, Argentine Migration to and from Israel. It is a beautiful presentation made by Alabama University Press, and I am glad that you are here so I can tell you what is this book about. But first, please let me start with the story. In September 1966, Israel was going through an economic recession known in Hebrew as mitun. Back then, the Jewish population of the young country was just of 2.5 million. The Zionist ideology was harsh with those who decided to leave the country, and they were pejoratively called Yordim, meaning those who descend. They were the opposite of the immigrants, proudly named Olim, those who ascend. In this context, a group of Latin Americans decided to leave the country, and while crossing the Atlantic, they wrote an open letter to the people of Israel from the Yordim on board the Jerusalem. None of us are happy about returning to our countries of origin, professionals, intellectuals, artists and workers. But most painful is the case of young people who, driven by a patriotic spirit, went to Israel to serve in the army and after much effort to settle in the country, were unable to do so due to the complete lack of jobs and, in some cases, an inability to adapt to customs very different from our own. There are also former kibbutzniks among us, who, due to a lack of preparation, were unable to adjust to such a disciplined life. They tried to settle in cities and towns, but, as in our case, were unable to survive. So we see that they were trying to explain why they were leaving the country. And then, to close their letter, they wrote, "We are committed to fighting against the bad administration of the Jewish Agency, to defeat it and to return to Israel to stay." Wow! So let's see what is this book about. This fragment is from the chapter 3, and the book is full of stories like this. Between Two Homelands combines Israeli and Latin American studies by analyzing migration between Argentina and Israel from a historical and transnational perspective. Traversing fascinating chapters of Israeli and Argentine history, this book addresses Jewish migration to and from Israel, exploring little-known aspects of Israel-diaspora relations. This approach considers return migration as an organic component of the migration cycle. In the Zionist traditional view, Jewish emigration from Israel was often seen as a failure on the part of the migrant and as a setback for the Jewish state. My work, however, demonstrated that the Israeli experience left profound emotional, cultural and social imprints that became integral to the migrants' identities. Consequently, even many years after they returned to Argentina, a significant number of those who had lived in Israel maintained enduring and diverse connections with the Jewish state. Furthermore, a notable portion of them opted to return and settle in Israel for a second or even a third time. This work is supported by an abundant collection of primary documents written by Jewish leaders and Israeli officials in charge of migrants' absorption, letters written by migrants in Argentina, in Israel, and even on board the ships in which they traveled, press articles, statistical data, and in-depth interviews. In the inaugural chapter, the narrative unfolds the pivotal role of Jewish migration to Jewish Palestine and, subsequently, Israel right from the inception of the Zionist undertaking. Additionally, this chapter delves into the reasons behind the departure of individuals who choose to leave Israel, which became a matter of concern for the governing elite. It provides a comprehensive global perspective on Jewish migratory patterns, spanning the period from the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 to 1963, coinciding with the significant influx of Argentine Jews who came on board a ship called Flaminia. The second chapter examines the intricate interplay of cultural and economic factors that influenced the migration experience of Argentines who arrived in Israel around 1963. The majority of them hailed from the modest segments of society, measured in terms of their financial assets. Nevertheless, they had undergone a process of cultural modernization and had adopted urban consumption patterns that they found themselves missing in Israel. Confronted with the need to adapt to the frugal Israeli way of life, their circumstances grew even more complex against the backdrop of the economic downturn in 1966. Many migrants who attempted, albeit unsuccessfully, to establish themselves in Israel as shopkeepers, artisans, and independent professionals, as they had done in Argentina, suffered a significant setback. Their decision to depart from Israel garnered attention from both the media and political leadership. I present the obstacles they had to face through three hitherto unknown cases: the experience of those oriented to industry and commerce in Ashdod, a development city that had grown beyond what was initially planned, the Moshav Kohav Michael Sovel, where Argentines carried out various agricultural projects, and in the pages of the Argentine Jewish magazine La Luz, whose editor had lived in Jewish Palestine and was the only Argentine source to report on Argentines leaving Israel. Of course, not many Jewish sources were willing to report that Jews were leaving Israel. That was a very controversial issue. The third chapter investigates the factors that caused some of the migrants to return to Argentina. It reveals that they incurred in excessive indebtedness that was possible due to a lax lending policy on the part of the Jewish agency. The situation gave rise to an embittered atmosphere in the press and among the returnees to Argentina. Part of the latter left unpaid debt in Israel, and two opposing narratives emerged regarding the reasons why the Argentines left Israel. According to Jewish agency officials and some journalists, the Argentines were physically weak and used to an easy way of life. According to the returnees themselves, the Israeli recession and inadequate treatment by the Jewish agency had prevented them from obtaining employment. In this book, I analyze both narratives as part of a reconstruction of a voyage aboard the ship Jerusalem, which sailed from Haifa to Latin America with around 200 returnees on board. Migration of Argentines to Israel again showed a growing trend after 1969, when Argentina went through a new period of economic crisis and political instability, while Israel was experiencing a short-lived golden period that followed the Six-Day War. Among the Argentine migrants arriving in Israel, some came a second time. They were economically vulnerable people who had suffered recessions in both countries. The fourth chapter analyzes migrations during the years 1973 and 1974. In Argentina, these 2 years were marked by the return to the country of the exiled and controversial leader Juan Domingo Perón, the short-term economic expansion managed by his government, and increasing political violence. In Israel, the Yom Kippur War ended 6 years of prosperity and widespread optimism. I compared the profile of Argentine migrants arriving in Israel in 1973 with those who had arrived a decade earlier. Among the migrants who arrived in 1973, there was a significantly higher percentage of professionals with university degrees, approximately 8 times greater. These migrants often liquidated their assets in Argentina and departed the country before it succumbed to economic recession. Consequently, the 1973 arrivals in Israel were culturally and economically better equipped. Their primary challenge, up until the Yom Kippur War, centered on a bottleneck within the construction sector, which impeded their ability to purchase houses as swiftly and to the standards they desired. Following the war and its profound impact on Israeli society, a portion of them chose to return to Argentina. The fifth chapter covers the period 1974 to 1978, focusing on the experiences of those who returned to Argentina after the Yom Kippur War, and those who choose to migrate to Israel to escape Argentines' growing political violence, state terrorism, and economic decline. Within the Jewish community, the impact of the Yom Kippur War was twofold. On one hand, it led to the return of Argentine Jews from Israel. Simultaneously, the emergence of leftist movements rendered Zionism an attractive option for the majority of young Jewish Argentines. Political clashes involving various factions, paramilitary groups, and guerrilla organizations escalated until the onset of a military dictatorship in 1976. On the other hand, there was an uptick in the number of students migrating to Israel. During the early days of the dictatorship, many of the migrants were involved in leftist activities, and their motivation was primarily driven by a fear for their safety. As the government implemented trade and financial liberalization policies, some of those adversely affected by the economic consequences of these measures also chose to migrate. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin held the belief that Argentine Jews were in jeopardy, and Zionist leaders had high expectations for a substantial influx of Argentine Jews to Israel. However, they found themselves disillusioned, as the military dictatorship did not trigger a significant wave of migration. Furthermore, it was unable to deter some migrants from returning to Argentina. The epilogue spans a period from the early 1980s to 2006. With the restoration of Argentine democracy in 1983, some exiles chose to return from Israel. The Argentine economy was in dire straits, and a significant portion of the population endured the repercussions of hyperinflation in both 1989 and 1990. However, the increase in the number of migrants to Israel remained relatively small. In addition, 2 terrorist attacks occurred in Buenos Aires, targeting the Israeli embassy in 1992 and the main Jewish community center in 1994. These attacks led to only a marginal increase in the number of migrants to Israel. The real growth in migration took place when the economy entered a long recession and vast sectors of Argentine society began to be defined as new poors. These dire circumstances faced by impoverished individuals in the early 2000s were so severe that even the escalating number of terrorist attacks during the Second Intifada in Israel did not deter their migration. Nonetheless, their outlook and choices began to shift around 2003. During that period, they were enduring the violence in Israel and following the news about Argentina's emerging recovery. Consequently, the substantial return of migrants once more became a focal point of media attention and garnered the interest of those responsible for Israel's absorption system, echoing the situation in the 60s. The epilogue, based on in-depth interviews, also offers an initial reflection on how migration to and from Israel contributed to shaping the identity of Argentine Jews who lived between two homelands. As you may have noticed, this book is full of stories and study cases, statistical data, a lot of information and a lot of documents that you are going to enjoy. Check on the description box down so you can find the discount coupon and you can get the book with 30% discount from Alabama University Press. Thank you very much for being with me in this book presentation, and I look forward to continue discussing this book with you. Bye bye.